All right, I want to introduce you a bit to the custom preflop solver that I use the most, which is Simple Preflop. This is going to be a pretty multifaceted tool, and depending on what it is that your main game uh, is or what your focus for study is, I think it's pretty versatile. What I end up using it a lot for is live cache. I might call them experiments. I'll show you what I mean in a little bit. But the key difference between this and, let's say, Munker solver, which I think is the most commonly used custom preflop solver for high accuracy, is that the parameters are trimmed down and the textures, like the flops, turns, rivers, are bucketed to be simpler. And for that reason, you get a much faster output with pretty good accuracy. So Simple Preflop serves a similar purpose, I would say, to a program like HRC, although you might have some preferences over what interface you like better. But it's more appropriate for simple questions. and I swear I'm not using that intentionally. The simpler questions that you might have about preflop in comparison to having the perfect solution for the 500 Zoom games on PokerStars. If your goal was to have the absolute perfect preflop solution for a specific game, I would use a different program, most likely Munker Solver. And I would most likely hire someone to do that for me because I'm not comfortable enough with Munker to do it myself. But with Simple Preflop, you'll find that a lot of smaller questions can be answered very quickly, and they have a lot of good functionality to do that for different game formats. So I'll talk a little about the specific strengths. The customization and the relative speed are going to make this sort of equivalent to Munker Solver, but again, a lot more achievable to use this on your home computer, more achievable to get results in a day or in less than a day, whereas a lot of Munker Solver sims might take weeks or months to get high accuracy. They do offer ICM and bounty functionality, as well as for cash game players, some adjustments available for antes, for straddles, and for changing the way that rake is contributed to the pot. So these are the reasons that I like using the program in the way that I'll show you in a second. And I will say that the end goal for me when using this program is not necessarily to get the preflop charts that I plan to use in game. It's the tool that I use to study the theory of preflop. And in my evaluation, I talk about distinct differences between understanding preflop theoretically and then executing preflop in your game. So this is a tool to kind of bridge the gap there. If I was looking for, again, that perfect reference material for your specific game, I would outsource that. I would recommend using either Munker if you're comfortable with it, or hiring someone to use Munker to set it up exactly the way that you need it. But to be a stronger, intuitive player, a more capable player in a lot of different game formats, I do think that exposure to lots of different solutions and lots of different structures is valuable for that. And for me, it's helped a lot to understand just the fundamental differences. What changes when we're at this stage of the tournament? What changes when there's a bounty? What changes when there's an ante, when there's a straddle, when you change the rake? So I'll show you quickly now how I use Simple Preflop to answer those questions. So here you're going to see a preflop solution that I've labeled 8 max 200 big blind. This is, as you can maybe see on the right, a 200 big blind deep cash game. No ante, no rake in this case. So I'm mimicking what I would say is closest to a 5-10 live game in Las Vegas. And for that reason, the preflop sizes that I chose were 3x opens for the most part. So I'll reiterate the point that I made in the intro. The purpose of this solution is not to have the best possible opening ranges or the best possible preflop charts for that game, but it serves as, let's call it a baseline or the sample for the experiment that I'm doing, which is how do I adapt to the live environment? How do I adapt my preflop ranges for live play based on different things like open sizes, rake structure, straddles, antes? These are all things that, depending on where you play and depending on what the stakes are going to come at you differently. And it would be quite expensive and to me kind of impractical to run high accuracy custom solutions for all of those different environments, especially if I'm only going to be playing it, I don't know, a couple times a year at most. So I would rather, for my own learning and for some of my students who focus on live cache, I would rather teach them to be more versatile in their understanding of preflop ranges, and it's going to start by having just the baseline strategy. So this is the baseline: 200 big blind, 3x opens, no ante. And we might be interested in looking at a spot. I'll just pull up a situation that I wanted to use to highlight the differences between the structures, which is hijack open, button call, small blind, or basically putting you in the blinds. And there's two things that are going to be of interest here. One is the out of position strategy just in general. And two is the improvements or changes that we could make if we adjust the preflop sizings here. So what I noticed when I first ran this sim was that I wasn't too satisfied with the 3-bet sizes, especially for out of position. I set it up very quick. The bet size options were very simplistic. I wasn't particularly concerned about accuracy. And for some purposes, this can be okay. What I wanted was, again, the default starting point, and then I wanted to compare things from there. So this small blind strategy has a pretty small squeeze. And then the big blind strategy following that also has a pretty small squeeze. You can kind of tell, or at least I suspect, that it wasn't solved to super high accuracy because an all-in 3-bet is being used sometimes. Maybe I'm underestimating the value of an all-in 3-bet for 200 bigs over a 3x open and a flat, but I suspect this is just a bit of inaccuracy in the solution, as I saw in other places as well. So let's keep this strategy in mind for the moment, and I'm going to show you a updated sim that I ran afterwards. Okay, so here is the refreshed version. You can see that it's only 5 max, and the reason for that is once I had my 8-handed sim, which took a while to run, even using simple preflop, full 8-handed trees with 200 big blind stack depths, it's going to take a while. I want to say that ran for about 3 days before it was accurate enough that I felt comfortable. It might have even been as long as like a week, but that initial sim took a while. Now here, because I'm looking at hijack versus button, I could trim out the first 3 players without losing a whole lot of information. If I wanted to be very precise here, I should have left them in and set up a card removal bet sizing tree. In another video, I believe actually it was in a Run It Once video that I was recording recently that I showed the way to set up card removal. If you're interested in that and you're an elite member, I believe it was the ACR Final Table series that I was recording recently at the same time as I'm recording this course. So in there, I showed that you could set up like a card removal bet sizing and then select ranges that remove all the cards that would have been folded from those positions to make the results a little more accurate. I haven't found that there's massive impacts on the stuff that I'm looking at here, though. When you're playing 200 big blinds deep, that would have a much greater impact in like a tournament scenario where you're looking at 10 big blind shoving ranges or something like that. But here, I think we're going to be okay without that. So I trimmed it down to 5 players. That's going to make it run a lot faster. I also improved the out of position 3-bet size. And you might be wondering, how do I know it's an improvement? Part of that is my intuition for the spot, but also part of that is using one of the features in simple preflop. If I look at this node here, small blind fold, you can see the Nash EVs for all the players still in the pot are displayed. So small blind is folding, they're losing 5. That's the size of the small blind. Big blind right here has an EV of minus 6.636. They haven't acted yet. So this is their full strategy EV. If I go forward and I look at, they're calling, they're raising, they're folding, the EVs are going to change depending on which node I'm clicked on. So it's important to be one node behind here to see the EV of the full big blind strategy that has yet to come. I could do the same thing on the button call strategy. I can see the full small blind EV of what's yet to come. Now let's quickly go back to the original sim and see how those have changed. So here's the original big blind EV for the scenario where small blind folds. It's minus 6.79. It's a bit more than a 0.1 different, like 0.1 worse in this scenario. And in the button call scenario, small blind has lost a similar amount. Their strategy is about 0.1 worse in this scenario compared to the updated sim. So pretty, this is a 100th of a big blind in the overall strategy. But within the 3-betting game tree, I think we've made pretty significant improvements by making that change. And it's just quite simple to make that change. Again, a bit of wordplay seems to be slipping in here. So if I look at the updated sim, I'm also going to be curious to see the difference in the structure or the VPIP overall for this range to see, okay, once I'm going 5.3x or whatever the new 3-bet size is, what do I need to keep in mind to make sure that I'm playing that spot reasonably well? And because we've updated the sizing to our liking, that's going to be the chart or the part of the simulation that I'm more interested in replicating when I actually play. All right, so here, the small blind strategy honestly is not that different. And this is something that I've found pretty often when I look at 3-bet ranges. They're already so constricted by the amount of chips that they have to put into the pot that when you optimize the sizing, you don't necessarily see a huge difference in frequency. Unless I was to go way too big or way too small, then you would see some pretty strange deviations. But here, 6.5% squeeze with a little bit of calling. This is a strategy that makes sense to me and looks like a reasonable guideline for the scenario. It strikes me as slightly tight. That might be specific to the structure that I've input here. It also strikes me as lacking some potential profitable calls. That might be specific to the squeezing strategy that comes behind, or again, just the larger open sizing with no ante that I'm not used to. So additional questions are starting to come up before I feel confident about locking in this strategy. And those are the types of questions that I would continue to run more experiments to get to the point where I understand what type of strategy I'm actually planning to use at the table. So maybe I would continue to ask, why am I playing this tight? Could I 3-bet more broadways? Could I flat more suited aces, suited kings? Could I flat more pairs, suited connectors? What would go wrong in those scenarios? If I wanted to use node locking features, if I wanted to experiment with different sizes, with antes, I could trim down, I could run quick experiments to answer those questions, and then come up with the ranges that I'm personally interested in using based on the game that I'm familiar with. All right, so I do want to talk about the shortcomings of this program as well. The sizing interface is a frequent complaint of Simple, and one of the reasons I think a lot of tournament players gravitate towards HRC, because HRC has a lot of the same functionality. And the newest version, as I understand it, has very good post-flop, what do you call it, like the replication of post-flop play, rather than like check down to simulate realization of equity. They've gotten a lot better in the 2.0 beta version, at least at the time of recording. So I do think that that's a very reasonable alternative. I'm just not highlighting it in this course because I've not used it as much as I've used Simple Preflop. But the sizing interface on simple is not the best, but in my opinion, it's good enough. And again, when answering basic preflop questions in the way that I'm asking them, it's not important that you get the sizing perfect. It's just important that there's a reasonable distribution of sizes offered on all streets. The post-flop limitations I kind of talked about at the beginning. Everything is bucketed, and you can adjust based on your hardware, based on your time allotment to these sims. You can make them more or less accurate. But of course, it's all being truncated in some way to make it feasible to run these more complicated trees. So I do generally recommend going with simple post-flop, not literally simple post-flop, but simplified post-flop options in an effort to run more complex preflop solutions. So if I wanted 8-handed with deep stacks, I would offer very simple post-flop parameters. If I am running a smaller tree, maybe 4-handed, 50 big blinds, final table, maybe we can get more precise in those situations because there's not a lot of preflop data to sort through. It would be a good opportunity to get higher accuracy by offering more bet sizes in more spots. But there are just limitations in the program itself. I think they only let you choose 4 bet sizes per street, and those apply to every single line for that street. So it's a lot less precise than PioSolver, for example, where you can specify, only use these bet sizes for these lines. You can use as many bet sizes as you want, etc. There are still hardware limitations on this program, but they're not quite as strict, I think, as something like Munker or PioSolver. You can get by on a pretty basic desktop computer running sims for this, but again, the more complex questions you're asking of the program, the more hardware capacity you're going to need. So the things that I have seen people make mistakes, and these are somewhat small mistakes, but I will point out in the software what's happening here in the settings. I think it's going to make more sense when I show you the program. So here's the screen that I was showing before with my 5max simulation. If I look at the bet sizing, you can see there's a few settings in here that could lead to potential problems. The number of bets and the number of maximum players are a big factor in determining how large your sim is going to be and therefore what the hardware requirements are going to be. So in an effort to simplify, I often see people going to, 4 bets or 3 bets maximum, or maybe 4 or 3 players multi-way. I would try to avoid this whenever possible. Unless, of course, you're running like a 3-handed sim, then it's not important that there's, 5 players max multi-way. But this will lead to some hidden problems. And even this number of bets and max players can be limiting in some larger solutions. So for example, if you were looking at a 7-handed scenario where under the gun opens and then under the gun 1 3 bets, you're already getting to the point where the configuration restriction here is going to influence the way that the next few players play. If another player enters the pot, they get closer to the possibility of locking out future players, which might make fringe hands more inclined to play. Because they know, if this was limited to 3, then under the gun 2 could make a 4 bet, and then middle position doesn't even get to play the pot. So there are some rare scenarios that are impacted by this, and I think that it's important to keep it at the max setting whenever possible. This is the bet sizing interface that I was referring to, and as you can see, the options that I've put in here are pretty limited for this scenario. I don't think that this is a major problem leading to post-flop, for example, only having 1 flop bet size and 1 flop raise size other than all in. That said, I haven't run extensive experiments to see how different the solution would be if I offered 2 or 3 different flop bet sizes, for example. But this is a larger tree situation with a lot of money behind. I know how much complexity that's going to add and also how much RAM it's going to require and how much time it's going to require. And I just wasn't interested in doing that. So I offered, pretty good turn bet sizing, pretty good river bet sizing, all-in abilities at every stage after the first bet. I think we're generally okay there. But again, you do want to be careful in the way that you set up these bet parameters. So another thing to pay attention to, as I called out at the beginning of the video, is card removal. If you do want a more accurate solution for situations where you know that players ahead are going to be folding. For example, if this was supposed to be an 8-handed sim and you just wanted the first 3 players to fold, the better way to run this would have been to have some sort of bet sizing scheme. I call it card removal RFI. It's very simplified. It literally just lets them open jam. And in doing so, you've given them one action to take. And then you can set the range that they're going to fold. So if you go in here, if you want their entire range to start with a fold, you can force that in this window. If you want 80% of the range to play a fold, you can force that in this window. And you can determine before the sim gets run the way that these early street actors are going to play before getting to the part of the sim that you're interested in. And that way you've created the correct card distribution for those later positions, rather than just the way that I set up this sim, deleting the players in front. I do think this doesn't have major issues for a big simulation like no ante cash 200 big blinds, but it could have some issues again for shorter stack play and for high pressure tournament situations. The last thing to point out is just running to proper accuracy. When you do go to calculate, you can see there's a lot of information here. There's a lot of settings. I'll quickly run through. These are the buckets. These have been set to extremely accurate buckets, and you can see that as a result, it takes a lot of RAM and a lot of iterations to get through. The alternative, you can choose from the download list, smaller buckets, lower quality textures. As I understand it, this basically just means they'll use fewer pieces of data to simulate the game tree on later streets. And in doing so, everything is more simplified, a little bit less precise, but a lot faster. Requires less RAM to do it. So adjust these to your liking. I'm pretty sure there are videos on YouTube that describe it in more detail. And once you do run it, make sure you run enough iterations so that it gets to a reasonable degree of accuracy. What any solver is doing is it's just trying everything you've allowed it to try until it figures out how good of an idea those plays are. So going through all the options a number of times is going to be required so that it exhausts every single option, more than once, more than twice. So what this is telling you is how many times has it iterated per decision point. And doing 400,000 iterations of the whole tree only leads to 46 iterations per node. Now, I've been told 50 plus is pretty darn accurate. You could go lower. You could probably get reasonable results for a lot of things at 20. But the point is, you want to set this number high enough that every single node in the tree has been addressed a good number of times. And it's easy to forget, I think, when we're setting up really big trees, how many iterations it takes to hit every node. We've created a lot of nodes. This is a pretty small tree for cash game players, and it appears that I've got about 10,000 nodes based on this. So keep that in mind when you're setting this up. Again, if you're not familiar with the parameters here, you can see that there's chip EV, there's ICM, there's bounties. All of this stuff can be customized to your liking, which is the main way that I like to use it. Changing the rake percentage, even using preflop rake. So any different game format that you might want to run an experiment for, I think this is a great program for that. So in summary, these are my best practices for using preflop solvers or simple preflop in particular. The first one is more sims is better, which refers to the idea that I'm not just trying to run the one perfect sim for my game. I'm looking to iterate, run experiments, change parameters, change sizes, change blind structures, change rake structures, and just learn how all of those different variables are going to influence the preflop results. And once you've learned the mechanics, then you're really understanding preflop and your theory is becoming a lot stronger. So that's why I wrote the second point, mechanics is greater than memorization. Memorizing one set of charts is great if that's the only game you ever play, but it doesn't even give you the best possible results in that one game. because you've only set it a certain way. You don't know the limitations of your parameters. If someone else made it for you, you don't know the limitation of their parameters. So you've gone through all this effort to memorize the perfect execution of a strategy you don't fully understand. So I do think that when using these solvers, you can learn the mechanics behind preflop, and in doing so, you're going to be a much stronger player. Node locking, I didn't show this feature in detail, but being able to adjust, as I mentioned in post-flop solvers, is a really essential skill, and it is the result of GTO play or GTO solver use. A really strong exploitative player understands the maximally exploitative strategy to any particular leak, to any particular flaw in someone else's strategy. And that's what solvers are trying to dig out. If you tell it that the parameters force some kind of mistake for your opponent, it's going to take full advantage of that. So testing your comfort with preflop adjustments through the use of node locking is going to be a really powerful asset in this program. And sanity check I put at the end here is really just a follow up on more sims is better. If you're ever running a preflop solution and the results just truly don't make sense to you, run more sims. Try to figure out why, right? Compare it to material you've seen in trusted places. Look at training videos, verify in the Discord server, talk to other people in your study group. Try to compare as many sims as possible for a similar situation so that you can get to the bottom of why your sim looks so unusual compared to, what you've seen in the past or what you understand. And that way you can figure out if there's a theoretical gap that you're trying to fix, or if there was just some bug in the setup of that sim. So hopefully this helps you make the most of your preflop solver of choice.